Hello, quilting friends. Today I want to talk about borders. You know, that last step that can stall a project. I've got quilts sitting here that all they need is a border and it's been months. But today we are going to tackle that issue. I'm going to show you how to attach borders so that your quilt stays nice, flat, and square. But first, we need to decide, does the quilt even need a border? Just because the pattern says so doesn't mean you have to add that border. I'm going to show you some examples because I love the modern aesthetic of asymmetrical quilts, lots of negative space, and that alternate grid that doesn't follow the traditional pattern, you know, of blocks in a row with sashing and borders. Let that quilt extend over the edge. Let your imagination go wild with some of these borders and just play a little bit. Now, you may want a border for some specific reasons. It tends to contain the design. It gives your eye a place to rest. So with this quilt, dry brush, although I initially thought it was done without a border, when I put a vote out to my audience, they all said, yes, definitely put a border in. And some people even suggested 2 borders. And I am a fan of the accent border. I love putting a small splash of color in before that final border. Now, borders are very effective at increasing the size of your quilt. So I love to play with borders and panels, and you can see that in these next examples. I used multiple borders to extend the size of my design. You can incorporate additional blocks in your quilt and just build on those borders. There are some fun quilt designers out there that are hosting round robin events where you just continue adding those fun borders around a central square. So how do you decide what size your borders should be? I follow a simple rule that my border size is somehow going to relate to the overall size of my block. So if I have a 12-inch block as the majority of my quilt, then I know I want my borders to be some factor of 12. So 2, 3, 4, 6. Those are good sizes for a 12-inch block. You can always use that 1-inch spacer border, that accent border that I mentioned. A lot of times I'll do that 1-inch border and then a 2 or 3-inch final border. Makes a nice ratio, 1:2, 1:3. Or if I use a 2-inch border, then I'm going to go up to maybe a 4 or a 6-inch border because I want that difference to be noticeable. Having 2 borders exactly the same size doesn't, at least for me, it doesn't play well. I like some contrast there. You know, quilters are all about contrast. So once I've decided on the size of my border and cut and join my strips, then it's ready to attach them to the quilt top. So let's get started on that part next. Okay, once we've decided that our quilt does in fact need a border, we want to figure out how big that border should be. So the accepted procedure is to measure across the top, middle, and bottom and average those. So I just have my quilt folded in half so that I can quickly, if I could see my mat, quickly measure what that quilt is, and I'm about 60, you know, if I really stretch that out, I'm about 61 there, and then we'll do the same thing across the middle. Yep, I can stretch that to 61. And I'm not really, you know, going crazy at stretching. I just need to know. Oh, and look at that. Bottom edge is, well, it's a little bit over, but you can ease that in. So yeah, so 61. And then we need to get the other dimensions. So I'll cut my first two borders at 61. And then I will need to add that length on because my width is 72. So I'll have to add the 6 inches that I'm adding for the top and bottom border. And then this will be, yep, 72. I'm right there at the edge of my mat. And if you had the space, obviously you could, you know, lay the whole quilt out on the floor and get a flexible tape measure to measure that. And but we know what our dimensions need to be, so I can set the quilt aside and then cut my borders. I've already sewn my strips, press those seams open, so I have one long strip for all of my borders. That way it's easy to get the length that I need. So I am going to cut off the selvage. And then I said I needed 61. So I am going to double layer this, you know, get my 2 layers together all nice and straight and not twisted with this big long strip. And I am going to measure that out to 61. So the easiest way to do that for me is to come over here, I lined it up at 0 over to the 30. And then I'm going to take that mark and put that right on my 0 and carry this over, make it nice and flat. 30 plus 31 gives me the 61 that I needed for the top and bottom. And then the rest of this will be long enough for the sides. So I'm setting that aside. And what I am going to do on each of these so that they are ready to go is I'm just going to fold them in half and I'm going to put a pin right at that halfway mark. And that will let me line that up with the quilt top in just a second. So again, I'm folding it to find the middle, and I'm putting a pin right in the midline of that border. And then I bring my quilt top back, and we want the 61 side. So I'll just double check. Yep, that's the one I want. And then again, I've folded this in half. I know which of these seams is my midpoint. So I'm going to lay that down, and I'm going to put the middle of the border right on that middle seam of my quilt. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to line up the corners, the corner of the quilt top and the corner of my border, and I'm going to pin. And I'm going to do the same thing on this other end. going to put a pin about an inch away from that corner. Now I'm going to hold on to both of those pins. I'm going to shake that a little bit so that it's even, and then I'm going to lay it down, and I'm holding it in place with my thumbs, and I'm pivoting my fingers in to the middle, and I'm going to keep putting pins in, and at the middle until I'm comfortable that that border is going to lay flat. There wasn't a lot of extra, you know, it's not like right here, I see this little bubble, and if I pull that so it's just tight, top and bottom, flat, and walk myself in, then I can see how many pins I need to keep that flat. If there's a lot of easing, you know, if your quilt wasn't quite square and you need to do a lot of easing for the border, then I would put more pins, because that's going to keep it, like I could put another pin in the middle right there. But I think I can, well, I'll go ahead and do that just because it does look a little bubbly there. Let me put another one on this side, and that will keep that border in place, and I can just, you know, as I'm sewing, I will keep that pulled tight and flat. I am thinking, now that I've got all these pins in, I've got a lot of seams on this quilt top. So I'm actually going to flip this over, and I'm going to repin from this other side. So everywhere I have a pin, I'm going to take it out from the border side and put it in on the piecing side. That way I can watch all these seams as I sew, and they won't flip over and, you know, get all crooked. So I'm just making things easier on myself. If I have a plain piece of fabric with no seams, that's always the side I want to put down under the needle. And if I had planned ahead, I would have flipped that over from the start. But sometimes with a big quilt top and a small border, it's hard to keep everything lined up on the table. So we like to work from the, you know, with the big part on the bottom, the quilt top. Okay, so we've got that one. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin the other end at the same time, and it's the middle of this is that point, so that will be easy to line up. And just like that, I have a finished quilt top, complete with borders and ready for the long arm. If you have any questions about putting on borders, please leave me a comment below. I'll collect them and answer in a future video. If you enjoyed seeing this process of how I get my quilts all put together and add those borders, then join me each Wednesday for a sew and chat session. I go live every Wednesday to work on my whips, those work in progress. I do not want to end up with UFOs in my sewing room. So join me every Wednesday right here. I'll see you soon.